Okay, welcome to week 21st tutorial, and this will be our last tutorial for this school year. And for today, we have two conceptual problems to go through, and each of them are relatively simple in comparison to what we have discussed in the rest of the class. Well, so let's begin. For the first question, it asks you, it says there is considerable disagreement as to whether government regulation has largely positive or negative influence on the economic growth. Compare and contrast the way in which government involvement in particular industry may positively or negatively influence the evolution of these industries. Well, first of all, when you mention government regulation, you must understand the purpose of introducing the entire regulation at all. So the basic idea is that regulation regulation provides orders between lots of different players. First set of player um, between the market and the customer, or the companies and the customers. 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 Well, from this point, basically what we are saying here is mostly the positive sides of regulation. Uh, Between company and customers, that's one of the aspects, and the other one could be between companies, companies that's already um, companies among companies, let's say. So first between company and customers, and among between company and company. And it also have an additional the most relevant effect to this course, which is between the incumbents and the entrants. Incumbent and entrants. Well, the first aspect, company and customers, that's easy to understand. Basically, regulation on companies. The company cannot collide or cannot overcharge the customer, or so the society can benefit from a relatively fair trade. And also that's why you might sometimes see some non-government organization will protest or to advertise the idea of fair trade, because there exists some industry in the world that are just not trading fairly. So the company does obtain most parts of the benefits from the trade. Um, and regulation at this kind of sense is essential. And the second point, between company and company. So between company and company is more about so between the competition within the market could go relatively uh, less aggressive. If the competition in the market become too aggressive, large company can simply swallow the smaller one, which is buying them off or pushing them out of the trade. So when this kind of competition happens, eventually the market will end up in some kind of disaster state. It's a vicious circle, and at the end, when all the small company be pushed out, the large company could essentially run as monopoly, which is also not quite beneficial to the customer, and it's not quite beneficial in terms of job occupation and stuff, because more company exists in the market could generally provides more uh, job occupation for the society, and that's something we need to consider also. But now let's focus back to this course and the last part of the course. It's focusing on the incumbents and the entrants. um well, so between incumbents and the entrants, well, the idea is for incumbents, and just let me quickly put down the stuff. Company versus uh, customers, protect the payoff, protect the fair paid off share between customer or consumers and the company. And between company and company, regulation usually protect against uh, protect against monopoly, or forced bite off. Okay. So for between incumbent and entrant, that is also another level um that's about the market, but it's more about people in the market and people about to enter the market. So about incumbent versus entrance. About incumbent versus entrant, usually regulation is more protective towards the incumbent. It's the companies, it's the player that already exists in the market. So what's happening here is that the government doesn't want too much disturbance in the market, so which can keep this market runs as smooth as it was. I mean, some entrant, if they are strong enough, they can still enter the market, like break some space for themselves, and they will survive in the market. But for those lesser entrant or more chaotic ones that usually jump between this market to the other market, for this kind of not quite fair disturbance or not quite sensible disturbance, the government trying to kick them out of the competition. And regulation, well, so between incumbent does have incumbent have some already developed skills, uh, already developed skills in compliance, in compliance. This kind of skill, well, it's usually developed according to the regulation. So it's like adoption of the regulation. So they are more suitable to survive under the situation. It's very much like if you have a, let's say if you have a new class, a old classroom that has its a grade 6 classroom, which everybody knows everyone already, and now a new student joined in, and if he wants to make friends, it's very hard for him because all the other people knows how the class has functioned, like who is the top dog, who is the more easier people to approach, and who is the most smartest people to relied on, and such. But the new guys, without any information, he would uh, be harder to join the group. So this is one of the advantage. And furthermore, incumbents could also have influence on the government. Incumbents could influence the decision, the regulation maker. The regulation maker and vote for regulation in favor of their interests. Well, this kind of scenarios is often seen. Uh, well, for example, in some, well, and it's usually being operated by those larger firms. Well, so to say, well, in let me see, what example to give here. Let's say in this way, it's less about regulation but more about evaluation. But it's similar stuff like how people evaluate stuff and how people regulate operation. It's more like the example I'm giving is that about the winemaking industry. So in the winemaking industry, every year there is a bunch of people that group together, taste a bunch of wine and decide which wine tastes best at what season, and that could potentially define the price of a wine in particular year, and it could also change the value of um, the group the grape farming field, and also the value of the entire um, company. And these people simply sitting there and making their decision. Sometimes they could come up with some other rules. Except for simply tasting, they could have some other rules that could also potentially influence the entire industry. For example, if they say our grape farm must be built, a potential great grape a potential great wine must be made under some particular condition, under some particular uh, landforms. Could put this kind of comments or this kind of regulation or this kind of experiential speech could potentially influence the entire industry and rise the price of some wine that actually grow and made under certain temperature, under certain condition, under certain environment. And that is just a example of how regulation could potentially no, sorry, how some incumbents could potentially influence the regulation maker and vote for some regulation in favor of their interests. And one other important thing to know is usually this kind of regulation committee. For example, the large oil price controller in Middle East. They are one of potential large player they are one of the large producers in the entire oil producing industry, and they're also the committee, also the person who's actually making the regulation. So the incumbents could potentially be the regulation maker instead of simply influence the regulation maker. That's one other thing to note. You can also write it on your comments, write it on your solution. It's something that's relevant. And that is so that is all we have for the potential positive side of regulation. Then what about the negative side of it? So there is one example to give. Shift it down a little bit. So something negative. So deregulation of airline shift primarily in well, so other things, negative sign about regulation. Negative sign about regulation. Well, negative sign about regulation. Potentially, whenever for economists, the simplest point of view you can always mention is that whenever some government kind of government related action is taken, like policy being announced, regulation is being made, well, just potentially any unnatural human influence that's put on the entire industry, and it's not by the natural force, it's not running by the market itself, it's running by some other people, the third party that is not actually involved in the market. This kind of action could potentially create that way loss. A general economics will, a general economic will suggested regulation could potentially create that weight loss. Well, so that it's no, I mean that's most general kind of economic view on regulation and on policy the government is making. Well, so back to the more general, back to the more micro kind of scale. What other potential influence, maybe good or maybe bad, could regulation be potentially providing for the entire industry? Some other things to mention in a more micro kind of way, in a more general sense, regulation could instill trust in the industry. Well, it could also work both. It could also work the other way around. If a regulation is is changing too often, it could potentially hurt the trust for the industry. So a stable regulation, I would actually add a more stable regulation could instill trust in the industry, because regulation is sometimes in not sometimes in many situations, well, regulation is usually being announced because some events happen in the industry. So people starting to realize some action could be harmful, and they or some action could be beneficial only to the operators and harming all other peoples. So whenever this kind of situation happens, regulators will starting to put our policy such that the market will not the market will not destroy itself because of this kind of harmful behavior. So, for example, in the old back in the old days, when people are writing checks and stuff, well, but back in the old day when printing money, yes, there was a huge scandal in there's a huge scandal back in maybe around First World War about money printing in Spain, I think. Sorry. Let me say something about it as instead of something in history. Let's say something more reasonable. More recent and more reasonable. It's about the estate market that's actually in Toronto. So the government has constantly because of too many people are trying to get in this market. Too many people are simply buying their house and not living in it and using the house as investment. This kind of behavior eventually drive up the renting price and also drive up the purchasing price of apartment and houses. Well, so what the government does, what the government wants, the government try to protect people who was not able to buy a house and people who or people who are able to buy a house but they are only buying their first house, so they do not have a self-owned house to live in, and to protect these people who are entering the market or who are the regular player, not the big player, not the investment players in the estate company. Government come up with a lot of different regulation, or sometimes you refer to it as policy. For example, like the empty, I think it's called the empty houses taxes or something. Well, essentially it's saying if you are not using the house, you need to pay additional taxes. So this policy leave all house being of most apartment and most houses be operated by someone at least, so no one can so the big investor cannot simply purchase a house and leave it there as investment, and just it's waste of it's waste of land property, and it's not efficient for the government, and it's also also extremely unhealthy if the housing price is just getting inflated too much. So it's a way. So regulation is a way that government trying to instill the trust in the estate industry, and this kind of thing is also happen very frequently when you are seeing in the um sorry regulation is also very frequently being introduced in the financial market. So whenever you see there is a um, depression in the financial market, you will always see some kind of new regulation coming out. For example, in the 2008 financial meltdown, the exemption from regulation is often cited as one of the well extension of the regulation is often cited as the reason for the meltdown, and after that, the US definitely have shrinking has tightened the strictness of the tax policy. I think, yep, that's sorry, but I think that's all I want to mention. So basically, let's recap what's going on. First of all, on the positive side, you can break the positive influence of the entire industry into three parts. First, is between the company and its consumer or its customers. It's and the second part, which is between the existing company within the industry. So it's about the competition within the industry. You want it to stay stable. So not a lot. When there are some people out of the market, there are not a lot of people out of market. So the market stay balanced for a long time or for a long run. And the third part, between the incumbents and the entrants, um, the regulation usually protect the incumbents, so the incumbents will not face too much stress from the entrants, uh, and the entrants could not easily break the already existing structure of the market. And for the negative side, it's usually just more general kind of view. Uh, Regulation potentially creates delivery loss. It's not efficient, and well, for more detail, you must give example. And sorry, I couldn't give any at this point, but then uh, that's just something I can mention. And to a more general kind of sense, a stable regulation could instill trust in the industry. That referred to um, when um, when trust is being when regulation is stable, that means the market is running smoothly on itself, and people will have more faith in buying products, in investing in the market, in uh, entering the market. But when regulation are not quite stable, or regulation are not covering all fields, for example, in the financial fields, just as we mentioned, when there are too much exemption that's being hidden from the public, it could potentially cause a lot of bubbles in our economic. Then the the eventual result, it's the tragic meltdown, depression for the economic growth, and that's essentially what's facing in 2008, because too much because regulation could not cover all fields, and uh, well, regulation could not cover all fields and cannot protect all the investors from the accident that's being happened. So to believe one actual zero kind of accident, but honestly, just too much bubble and being popped by that event. But yep. So regulation could not protect everyone from that depression, and thus when the bubble popped, the trust was the trust breakdown, and lots of events happen, like money run, like bank run, and this and that. So the financial market was unstable, was breakdown, and after recovery, you see a lot of new regulation. You see a lot of new regulation being introduced after 2008 for the financial market. And I guess that's all we have for this question, and that's all we recap for this question. Some of the points I have just simply speak it out, but most of the uh, most important stuff I feel like I should have put it onto the board. And now let's end question 1 here, and let's go to question 2. So welcome to question 2. Question 2 is about the 2008 financial crisis. So it describes following. The 2008 US credit crisis forced US taxpayers to cover losses on bad mortgage-backed security held by investment banks and insurance companies. And thinking of the US Treasury as the principal and investment bank as the agent, how might you design a bailout plan to ensure the investment bank will make only prudent investment going forward? And it's a relatively strange question to see, but it does have a solution. And just to quickly remind you, the three potential and most common solution to agency problem. They are one, monitoring, that's looking over your shoulder and trying to understand what you are doing at most every moment. Second, the performance-based contract. Well, performance-based contract is what we have, or incentives. Sometimes they refer to it as incentive. But the performance-based incentive or contract is what we have been working with in the last few weeks, and that just basically a base wage plus some kind of extra bonus, and that's how it works. And the third one is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, it's similar to regulation, similar to making policy, and just providing guideline for how people actually need to perform. And among the three, you definitely see monitoring is definitely working, because by monitoring is one of the solution, is one of the feasible solution. And what you can do is monitoring. You can require a firm to make more careful disclosure to regulators, and also you can, as the US Treasury, they can send in people to investment bank and check on 1 every 10 transaction to see what kind of investment they are making. And as a and these are the two examples we can give about monitoring, as it provides more information. Formation, the investment bank would need to investment bank order firms that's applying for the new mortgage would need to operate more careful. But just consider the case when let's say when the invigilator is working around you during your exams. You will try to be more careful about what you're doing, and even though you're not cheating at all, you will try to avoid eye contact, avoid eye shifting from here and there. Try not to. Well, sometimes you will considering for some people they will actually consider not to what kind of action that will not cause trouble, will not be accidentally considered as potential cheaters. These kind of things, it happen a lot. And that's just the effect of monitoring. And the other one that I would suggest that will work is bureaucracy. The idea is straightforward. Bureaucracy is another solution. The idea is straightforward as you provide more regulation on how the agent should operate. It potentially cuts off all the dangerous action. Limiting the action that is available to operator or the agents, or in this case the investment bank. The risk could be limited. Well, that is just how bureaucracy work. And one other so we mentioned two things that actually work, and we skipped the second one. So the second one must be the less possible way to work it through. Performance-based incentive. When we mentioned performance-based incentive, we can always give the most basic example about performance. Let's just first write down performance-based incentive is not feasible. Well, the most basic idea to introduce is that the A plus BX contract the A plus BX contract can only reward something. Can only reward, let's say, returns in this case. Well, so it is hard to measure. It is hard to make a centralized measure for the principal, so that they can both measure the risk and the value that is being created by the investment bank. And there is way to do it, but under the incentive-based contract, it's not so feasible. If we want to use performance-based incentive contract, there must be other things that are coming along with it. For example, more monitoring and this and that, which essentially, going back to the first idea we mentioned, monitoring definitely works, but performance-based incentive on itself definitely do not, because we can only use performance-based incentive on something that is measurable. Contract can only reward returns that is measurable. But in terms of risk, that is something that we not quite sure about how to measure. Even though the financial people, they do have this entire system of how they want to measure it, but those are not so solid, and not so immediately reflected on the payoff sheets. Well, so if you are using the performance-based contract and you're seeing X as how much return you earn, how much return you're exactly earning, then we are facing a fact that we once again ignore the risk. That is what the U.S. Treasury definitely do not want to see during the 2008 credit crisis. So what we are mentioning here is that A plus X contract can only reward return that is measurable, and however, it is ignoring the risk component. Well, so let's make an X here and two ticks on the other one. So the other two are working, only the performance-based contract are not. It's not so feasible. Not saying it's not completely useless, but then in this kind of scenario, you would prefer the other two more than the middle one. And yes, that's all we have for this tutorial. And this is the last tutorial. I'm happy that if you're actually using my video as reference to a tutorial. And if you're actually using my tutorial, I'm also very happy. And I hope if you guys are not graduated yet, for next semester, I hope you guys can return to the campus. And I do wish you good health for the rest of the year. See you.